Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States.
I am so sorry to my world. I am so sorry to my world. This is not what we want.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
It's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift.
Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Roger, how you going?
It's been one of those weeks. The whole family's come down with a case of gastro, and let me tell you, have you seen The Exorcist before?
Yeah, I have, but long time, so...
Yeah. How you doing, Andy?
A little bit triggered. Got it. We talked about Trump last week, right? And
we tried to.
Yeah. So I think there's this guy, like, God, he does something to our souls, doesn't he? Like, he's got this. You know what? Actually, I think it was. I mean, we had a conversation about Trump, but then I do the editing for the podcast, right? And I had to edit our conversation, right? And just for our listeners, the conversation that like made it to print was like a third of the actual conversation.
It's under our Olympics episode.
That's right. But as I was editing it, I was like, I wanted to respond like as I was this, like, and so I kept like messaging you with all these extra points, and you must have thought I was a maniac or something.
Well, like what do we say? Trump Derangement Syndrome, TDS, and that only makes it worse. By the way, if you ever say that to someone who's losing it about Trump. But yeah, this one has gotten to you. And I think at the beginning of our last episode, you said, I'm going to challenge myself because Trump is making me behave in ways that I don't normally behave. And then you doubled down.
Well, of course, I do think that was partly because I do think extending the generosity to have a conversation about Trump where you actually give him serious consideration, for me, is too generous. Like, that almost is wrong.
Yeah.
But we did have some exchanges subsequent to the episode and me editing and kind of having a bit of a tanty or whatever. and I think we sort of landed on that we'd have another crack at it under the approach of steelmanning each other's position. And I got to say, like, I've done this because I've done some homework in preparation for this episode. I do think this is like, and this is the power of this approach of steelmanning, which for anyone who isn't familiar with it, is where you, as the sort of the other side of an argument, give your best possible case in your own words of what the other side is saying. So you almost have to kind of give them credit for like the reasonable parts of what they're saying. You have to try and sort of come up with that more sensible position, right? And I do think this is a good way for us to maybe work out that we probably actually don't disagree about much. And I think it would be a good exercise even just for that.
I mean, I did have that feeling in our last chat that I thought that I conceded a lot and that we were on, I don't know, 90% alignment. But it's just that 10% that was a little bit too much for you. But I'm keen to get stuck into it because I think that, it just... Trump is divisive and it's probably a good case study. And I think in some of our conversations off air, I did kind of say, look, if the two of us can't talk about it, what hope does America have? But yeah, let's give it another crack.
Okay. Not to overcomplicate things, but I'm going to do that anyway. I have a 9-point suite of, not issues, but 9 points I think would form part of your view of Trump.
9's a good number, like they always, policy is like a 9-point plan because, it's not 10. Anything over 10 feels excessive, but 9 seems like it's the magic number.
But I'm going to add some additional complexity. I'm going to put them into 3 categories of like ones that I'm fairly confident that's part of your position, and then ones that I'm maybe a little bit certain of, but not like as
you're taking
confident.
it 3-dimensional. You're getting another axis on your quadrants.
Yeah, and then another that I'm not sure, but I suspect could be in the mix. So let's start with the first one, which is that, and I'm going to read from my notes here, which is that Trump may be generally unfit for office, but that doesn't mean that he has no redeeming qualities as a leader. For example, his outsider mentality and business background could have benefits.
Yeah.
Is that part of your worldview?
Yes, that is. Yeah.
So I agreed with that statement. So that's not, as a principle, not a point of like contention. However, I guess the nuance to like my view on that is that, yes, he may have some redeemable qualities, but like the orders of magnitude of his like negative qualities versus his positive qualities are so vastly different that it's almost moot. So you might be able to say, oh, he's got this business background that like would bring, you know, a different perspective to the job, make him a bit different or whatever. But at the end of the day, that's fine. But like, that's only like this small redeeming, offsetting thing to like everything else that's like really bad about him, right? And I guess the other thing is, I think, you know, and we could probably get to this later, but I think some of the things that I think you maybe intimated were like possibly like positive characteristics, like whether it's negotiating skills or whatever. Like, I'm not sure that they are actually like strengths. So, you know, for example, you know, like I don't necessarily know he's actually negotiating good outcomes. And even if he were intrinsically a good negotiator, if his objectives are not the right objectives, then that's almost like a weapon against him, right? So, you know, if he had good objectives and objectives you agreed with, being a good negotiator serves him. But if his objectives are not aligned with, you know, the public interest, then it actually becomes like a negative, right?
Yeah, I think there's a few words in the phrase, right, that I think probably come under contention or raise a certain kind of emotive response. And I think the main one is redeemable. Like, I think that's the thing there, right? So what I kind of would like to replace that with is that he has some characteristics and some skill set that has utility, right? And I think, to your point, it can be pointed in, you know, bad outcomes or negative outcomes. But to be totally honest with you, and this might lead into another point down the line, that even that is very, very subjective when it comes to politics, right? Whether something is ultimately positive or negative depends on your values and where you sit in the political spectrum. And the kind of things I was reacting to were more just that because of those, what you would call negative or irredeemable characteristics of Trump the man, you were just kind of writing everything off. Like he's stupid, he's got nothing, you know, he's a joke, all these kind of things. Where I do see, when I look at Trump, a deeply flawed person, but does have a mode of operating that we're not used to seeing, and probably is unfit for office, but has some utility. And I know that from, you know, my experiences in the business world too, that sometimes there is a place for a thug at the negotiating table, or someone who is decisive and gets things done when they need to be done, even if they're ultimately misguided. Like sometimes they have their place in the, you know, the hierarchy of the business world.
All right, let's go to like point number 2, right? So again, this is what I think is one of your positions. So you confirm whether, or, you know, add whatever nuances if you think I've got it slightly wrong or wrong. Okay, so if someone is obsessed with how bad Trump is, they can be blind to some of the key drivers of his support, such as disillusionment with Washington elites and policies that disproportionately impact forgotten voters, such as white, lower-class America, forgetting that Trump is at least partially a symptom rather than a cause.
Well, that's a tricky one. I feel like I'm walking into a trap.
I promise you it's not a trap.
But I do. If you're saying that, if that phrase is kind of saying that your appetite for Trump as a brand, as a person, as a figure, makes you less likely to take what he's saying seriously and the underlying populism that he's riding off, then yes, I agree.
Okay. So yeah, look, I mean, I think I agree with this point, right? So I think there are a lot of crazy people. And in fact, I think we both listened to a segment on Josh Sepps's Uncomfortable Conversation podcast where he was talking to someone for America regarding Project 2025.
Yeah.
And the whole starting point is that every single thing so Project 2025 is like the platform for Trump, or at least it's the alleged, platform conspiracy that's going to bring in. And it's got all these like hard right positions on a whole bunch of, different topics.
Yeah.
And the conjecture was that from Josh Sepps, he was saying to the, interviewee, he was saying, well, we've got to like draw the line where something is legitimately threatening to democracy versus when something's just not your kind of within your spectrum of like preference, right? So, you prefer apples, they prefer bananas, but like, hey, we're both eating fruit, so it's okay. So, I think in that particular interview, there was this like moment where he presses her and say, hey, like, are we just like getting obsessed over like policy preferences, or are we fundamentally like, can we focus on like the bits that are really truly threatening? And I think that the interviewee couldn't concede, like, for example, like the example was diversity and inclusion policies, that some people in America legitimately have a reason to oppose it. And she just almost couldn't concede that, like, that was an extreme position to oppose it.
I think it was even worse than that, man. That particular woman was denying that there were people who didn't feel the same as she did, right? I think the specific thing was that, it's not unreasonable that the average American wouldn't want their, 7, 8-year-olds learning about transgender ideology at school, right? And even that line triggered her, where she was like, no, actually, my people, my work surveys the relationship, and I know better than you, and everyone's on board, right? And I kind of, obviously I'm embellishing a bit, but that attitude of like, not only do I not respect your opinion, but it's dead wrong. Like, there is actually only liberals out there, and the far right is just this minority.
Yeah, so I think the issue, if you are so against Trump on the basis that his policies, or at least the things he's doing, doesn't align with your worldview, and then you almost think and you assume that, well, everyone must have the same worldview as you, and you can't quite really truly understand the signal that's coming through when people support Trump, that actually, like some significant portion of his support actually comes because they don't actually like the way you want to run the country, right? So I think it's really important, if you're going to have quite a negative view against Trump, as I do, that you're still kind of able to recognize that not everyone who supports Trump is like a racist, right? Or some kind of Nazi or something, right? That there might be some legitimate reason they support Trump. And they might be misguided or whatever else. Like, you can have all of those views, but at least that, you understand that he's actually kind of reflecting to the American people the things that they want, that they truly want, right? And in fact, that's his genius, right? It's that he can take those hot issues that people are passionate about, that the traditional politician from Washington hasn't kind of resonated with them. They haven't picked up on those issues and hit that spot, whereas Trump said, oh, hey, like, I can actually fill this gap. The fact that he's found the gap and he's exploited the gap explains at least a fairly big part of his success, right? So I guess what I would say is, yeah, I agree with that. But at the same time, like, I don't think that, like, I'm quite open to understanding that. Like, I'm very happy to have that part of it. So I don't think that characterizes me in my view of Trump.
Hold me back if this is part of your subsequent 7 points. But do you believe, Andy, that people who support Trump are ultimately on the most favorable end misguided and fooled by disinformation, and on the more negative end stupid?
I think there's probably a lot of his support where maybe they don't truly understand the risk of Trump, and they might look at him like he's like Trump's the kind of like the guy who will, he'll go and like buy you cigarettes and alcohol from the shop, right? And maybe even cocaine and heroin as well, right? But like, this isn't a good person to be dealing with, right? Or to be associating yourself with. So he might give you that thing that you want, but there's longer term, kind of consequences. And I think for me, like, a lot of this stuff comes from like the feedback loops as well. Trump has kind of amplified and accelerated like the feedback loop of being crazy, right? So there's a tribal element here that he's feeding on. So it's not strictly true to say that he's just a reflection, or he's a symptom rather than a cause. I think he's both. He is part cause, part symptom. But and I don't think you can ignore either aspect. But yeah, I think at the same time, like you see the memes or the clips of all the wokesters kind of crying and kind of
No.
yeah, like shouting in the car. There's this one clip I really love is there's a guy with a MAGA hat on a plane, and then this like absolute like traditional like you couldn't get a more kind of hippie looking boomer is seated next to him on a plane, and she thinks she's in the right, like she just starts abusing him, like how could you, I need to move, and she ends up getting kicked off the plane, like because and her husband's sitting next to her just so embarrassed, and they both get kicked off, and this guy's doing nothing, like he's just sitting there with his MAGA hat on, but just that starting point being that no, I'm right for opposing Trump, and I'm not going to entertain any. Like, I think that's not a good place to be.
Yeah, glad to hear it. All right, hit me with the next one.
All right, next one. Okay. I think this is the one that will be closest to you in terms of your feeling on it, which is that good conversation about Trump should involve the things he's talking about, and shutting down that conversation merely divides and isn't consistent with a good faith approach.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Like, I feel like our usual conversation style is very similar to that. We have a good separation between the idea and the mouthpiece, and the concept and who's saying it. And I felt that kind of breakdown. And the second is that it's okay to follow into the more kind of grey areas to try to find out the gold, right? And I think that the part here is like the good faith element. And I'll probably go back to it where in our last conversation, you started with a little bit like we can have those conversations about where the truth may lie and where the issues may be underneath all the rhetoric, the Trump rhetoric, right? But we have to have a basis of understanding first that Trump's an idiot. Or maybe not even that, maybe not an idiot, but he's dangerous, and he's, and we're kind of playing into it. And I think that was the part that is tough as well, because, part of it is really like the truest form of that style of conversation or discourse is that you should be able to take a Palestinian and an Israeli and have a conversation about the issues, right? Like, now, nothing could be probably further from the truth in reality, right? Like, if you got someone from IDF and Hamas and put them together and said, oh, let's try to find let's try to steelman each other's argument. It's just not going to work, right? Because there's no shared bridge there. And I felt that a little bit, even taken out of the Trump thing with the UK riots, somewhere between me offering out the whole idea about Islamic gangs and things like that, you switched it from being Tommy Robbins' idea to like Roger's ideas. This is what you think. This is what you mean. I'm like, no, I'm saying that. I'm repeating what. Anyway. So I think Trump has the ability to do that to people, because it's and I can see it. It's an internal frustration of why can't you see what I can see, and why aren't you over this side of the fence condemning it more forcefully? So you obviously don't believe that, or perhaps you're not coming into it in good faith either, and therefore you're not meeting that precondition for us to have this conversation.
All right. So I think, just because you mentioned the Tommy Robinson thing, I think there could be some parallels to what I'm about to say with that situation, but I'm actually less agreeable with you on this than I am with the other ones, which is, I guess, you can't play a game unless you both agree on the rules. And I think where maybe this falls down a little bit is that, for me, the interesting part to explore about Trump is actually his psychology. It's actually is Trump. And if you think we should be talking about his policies, there's going to be a bit of a disconnect there. So if the focus of the conversation is, his 10-point plan to make America great again, I go, okay, hang on. It's not the relevant conversation here isn't whether I agree with tax cuts or this particular policy on the border or whatever. It's different things. It's actually his psychology. So I'm interested in how his psychology shapes not just the policies he wants to take to the election, but every other policy that he's going to come up with downstream from winning, plus how he will respond to all of the things that we can't foresee now that will happen, that he will have to make decisions about. So for me, the conversation is about Trump. and I might flippantly call him an idiot. So we both have to agree he's an idiot. But that's code for me sort of wanting to talk about maybe his lack of competence for the job.
Yeah, and I get it. I suppose under that, a good analogy would be, us arguing about the Ten Commandments on the tablet rather than actually saying Moses is full of shit. and where did he go to get those tablets, right? It kind of looks like it's in his handwriting. And I can see the chisel in his pocket. Don't come at me, conservative Christians. So, look, I think I have time for that. I think it wasn't very well articulated in the skirmish of the conversation, but I understand now what you mean. That I think the difference between us is that perhaps you felt an added pressure of, well, by doing this, we're kind of playing into Trump's little game, and he's kind of taking us along for a ride, and I'm unwilling to do that. And you've used a term of, he doesn't deserve. We're being too generous by allowing him to set the table, so to speak. So, and I do understand that. I guess I just have more faith in people to navigate that, and maybe that's being a bit naive as well. That people can kind of understand and play around with those topics without, getting totally bamboozled by the person who's saying them.
Just to add to that, if we were to have a conversation in isolation about any single one of like Trump's policies, then I would absolutely be up for that. And you might find that I actually even agree with some of the policies. But at the same time, like for me, what's maybe triggering about Trump is the man Trump himself, which I think is a good segue to my next tier of claims. So these are the ones that I think I'm not sure how strongly these are, reflect your views. So, but I've thrown them in the mix because I think they might be part of it, or at least a version of your view. So the next one is that you think I am ideologically opposed to Trump because he doesn't fit the mold of what a politician should look like and sound like.
Interesting. I've never phrased that thought consciously in my mind, so it's half right. And I think the half that might be right is that I think that you have a respect of the fieldcraft or the capability set of a politician that has, I suppose, good economic or policy competency, and is a very good bureaucrat in the sense that they lead by consultation, or they kind of govern by have a very consultant style approach to committee and the facilities of a democracy. And I will agree with the last part, by the way, on this. But I think you place a greater weighting on that than perhaps I do, in a way. And I think maybe there's a source of conflict there too, that you sometimes think that there is one right economic outcome, or a set of policies, or a set of kind of public policy that is optimal. And I guess I'm a little bit more fluid with that. I don't actually see there being an optimal public policy in every case. I think that's kind of perspective driven, and it ebbs and flows, and it's cyclical. Like things get conservative and then liberal, conservative and liberal. And sometimes you try to deregulate or stimulate the market or do this and that. And I kind of feel like Matthew McConaughey on Wolf of Wall Street, where he's all coked up and he's like, nobody knows when the market's going to go up or going down. Nobody knows. That's the secret. And I'm a little bit more like that. So I don't know. That's my view.
Okay, well, I'll reflect a little bit on what you just said. So just on the policy thing, like I think there can't be an objectively optimal policy setting for any particular given thing just because everyone's different and has different things that they value, right? So you could have one group of people who value, small government because maybe they do well out of that state of affairs, but then you might have another group that support bigger government because that tends to mean, like, let's say more like social services, public goods, those kinds of things, which if you like are a regular person and you benefit from those things, you might value those things, but you can't sort of reconcile them as an optimal sort of position. But at the same time, there are some things which like are clearly the wrong direction to move in, and I think tariffs would be, the one example we spoke about on the podcast, where I think they're sort of universally regarded as like fairly bad things for no matter what your perspective is, right? Or if you do sort of care for the interests of people who maybe would be less of a beneficiary from free trade, there's other better ways to help them out than to kind of, let's have more tariffs, right? There's other ways to assist those people, right?
Even that, sorry, even that, right? Like, again, I agree with you, but because you put out such a strong black and white position, after that discussion, I just had a brief thing. I literally told ChatGPT saying, my friend thinks tariffs are bad, overwhelmingly, always. Give me one example of it, of where has had a positive outcome, right? And one of the ones that came up was really surprising to me. And it was the case of, in 1983, the US imposed a 45% tariff on imported motorcycles, right? Greater than a certain engine size, right? Specifically to shield Harley-Davidson, right? From Honda and all these Japanese kind of engines and things like that. At the time, Harley-Davidson was struggling, but it gave them enough room to essentially recover and restructure. And I think within a year or so, within maybe 3 or 4 years, the tariffs were lifted and they're now competitive and the brand survived from a legacy point of view. So again, not always. There are some good outcomes.
But see, Roger, the mistake you're making is you're looking at the impact of a tariff on one company. You're not looking at the impact of a tariff on consumers, on global, prosperity, on jobs, on consumer welfare, right? But generally speaking, if tariffs are let's say a symbolic, kind of stand-in for free trade, right? So the benefits of free trade are just immense, right? And if we went back to a world, and so when we talk about increasing a tariff on something, right, we're not necessarily just talking about the micro impact on that one category of good, which I would still maintain is going to be bad in overall terms.
What would the Hells Angels be riding if they didn't put that tariff down, man?
Oh, probably.
What about dykes on bikes? We'd miss all this stuff, right?
Probably a Yamaha, but the symbolic implication of moving to a world where we start putting tariffs on things again is basically moving in the wrong direction. It's reopening the door to basically getting rid of the thing that's given us prosperity, right? It's turning the corner. It's turning the tide on the momentum. But I don't want to get too bogged down in all of that. But I think what, for me, this point's about in terms of me being ideologically opposed to Trump because he doesn't look like a politician, I would actually distinguish between a politician and an administrator. So I think you're right. I definitely hold respect for good administrators. And I think that's the part where actually this is all about for me, because I don't think Trump is a good administrator. He's a terrible administrator.
Agree.
But as a politician, so the fact that he says these outland, I don't know, even something like him saying, using inflammatory language, or him getting up and saying she's a very bad loser, or whatever, something horrible.
Ted, your wife's a dog. You got a dog wife, Ted?
I actually like that. I actually find that, if anything, I'm more entertained by that. So I think I would just sort of say that the theatre of him as a politician is probably, for me, the one part that I'm the most attracted to, which is kind of the opposite of this thing. So it's actually just his brutishness almost, for me, is I'm almost come on, who doesn't like watching those videos of him on the stage, just being an absolute crazy man, right? But I think the administrator side, if we separate that is I guess is what you've said is I do appreciate. So that's my my thought on that.
All right, yeah, no, I'm willing to I definitely agree with you around the administration side. And yeah, I think, Australian politicians are more administrator than politician in a lot of ways.
All right, so next one is my rhetoric about him. For example, calling him a buffoon, a moron, that kind of stuff, indicates something more I've got something more pathological against him. I'm triggered, emotional. It's an emotional response. And even if those emotions are justified, they're still an emotional response rather than a logical response.
You know what it is? I think it's that people get really triggered by bullies, and Trump is a bully, right? And even, we talked about this dynamic before, when you see someone being a bully to someone, say like in the office, right? They treat people really badly, but they treat you really well. Yeah. And then you somehow can't appreciate how that person is a bad person because you're like, oh, they've always been really good to me, even though I can tell that they're a bastard to everyone else. And I think Trump has that kind of in-group, out-group mentality that he showers. He makes you feel like the only girl in the world, as Riri would say, if you're in the sunshine, and then as soon as you're out, you're a dog. You're a dog wife. So I think that, with Trump, it gets to that stage a little bit, right? Like it triggers this kind of response in people, and I kind of totally understand that.
So I will I'll put my cards on the table and say I'm definitely triggered by Trump, and I definitely do have like an emotional emotional response by Trump. Though I must admit, like some of that stuff, like the language and all that, is it's probably a little. To be fair, it's more rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
It's a podcast, we're shooting, shit on a Friday night or whatever, right?
I'm not gonna get pious on you, like right. Okay, for example, when Trump gets up there and just goes off about Kamala being stupid, she's not very smart. She's got a low IQ, right? Say what you want about Kamala, but 100%, she's not stupid. People that are operating at this level, they have a certain level of cognition, like they're in their own ways, right? Like you can't pass the bar and be a dropkick. Just like I believe, and this is where probably we depart, you can't run high levels of business or even fool your way into becoming the president or whatever it is without having a good level of intelligence. So I just don't believe on either side that like calling each other an idiot is a good thing, right? Because I just don't think they are.
Well, I think we can get to that on point 6, but but just on the whole triggered thing, right? I don't think I'm triggered by Trump himself, right? Because I've just said that, like, I'm not. If anything, I kind of enjoy his like rhetorical flourishes, right? So I don't think I'm triggered by like the bully aspect, because that's how you sort of framed it. I think I'm more triggered by, and it is something you mentioned before, but like I'm triggered by the potential that others cannot see what I see of Trump. So, and I'm just trying to trace back my own kind of recollection of him. I think I was always sort of intuitive enough to know that Trump was not going to be like a good option for America, right? Right back to like his first nomination, and then he won. But I think I was probably there was probably a time when I was willing to kind of be open-minded about him, and maybe I would at some point, like I would probably have I probably was even more open-minded even than you are now, right? So about him, but there was a time when certainly through his presidency where it just became so clear to me like how fucked he was, right? And it was around probably the time like 2018-19 particularly, because I remember reading a book by Bob Woodward called Fear. Also, you had the Mueller report come out around that time, and you just had all these stories about how chaotic his administration was, like, and not his administration actually, but Donald Trump was, like how just unhinged he was, right? So things like he would say something and then they'd all be like, okay, how do we do? We better take that briefing off his desk because he's going to fuck this up, right? Like, and just like them just completely having to save Trump from making all of these mistakes. And just, it was this relentless kind of, and there's so many people. It's not just like one kind of, one person who fell out of favor and wants revenge and they say all this stuff. It's just like how many people are saying these kinds of things about him that have worked with him. And, and it's all clear from like all these like documented, reports and things, right? And you saw it through COVID and all that sort of stuff. So for me, like his like, let's just like label like Fauci and turn him into like a political. I mean, this guy's like a freaking, scientist doctor who specializes in like, he made mistakes or whatever, but like turning him into like this political figure, like as like, and making him like a political object when he's just like a freaking like public servant, like scientist, he's not how bad some of these decisions were, right? And for me, so I guess back to like me being triggered, right? I've got this like perspective on him that I've had since sort of that 2018-19 period. And I just I can't imagine how someone can not see what I see. And I can only imagine that it's maybe ignorance, or it's people aren't exposed to it, or they're misguided or whatever. But for me, it's just there's very few things in politics that are black and white. But this is akin to the Earth not being flat. This is pretty clear. And so when people kind of talk about it as though it's not clear, that triggers me.
I get it. Probably not the best example with Fauci, because even just saying his name will.
But think about that for a second, right? Here in Australia, we had Kerry Chant in New South Wales, but various others in other jurisdictions playing this same exact role, and Fauci is no different. There's no different between the role of Fauci. I mean, there is probably some difference in their role descriptions, but they're essentially the same thing. They're a respected bureaucrat whose whole career is to understand the nuances of things. I think probably the biggest criticism you could make of Fauci is around the mask thing. But this was a pretty fucked time. They didn't know, this is when he was saying, don't wear masks because it's it doesn't spread by that. And then oh, by the way, we're going to turn 180 degrees. Oh no, you should wear masks. And, the reason they were saying don't wear masks is because they wanted to keep supplies or something, so this whole they lost trust, right? But I just think that the instincts to politicize a figure like him, and the fact that he is controversial now, is that whole feedback loop thing I was talking about before, that he did create a world, a universe where it was within the realms of normal discourse to criticize a freaking public servant, you know what I mean, whose sole job is to, but anyway.
Yeah. Look, I tend to agree in terms of pushing those boundaries. I kind of, I had in my mind this similar thing around when they talk about American gangs versus the cartel, where even in the gangs they had rules, right? They wouldn't go after certain families, or they wouldn't do this, they wouldn't that, and the cartels just come in and there's a new level of brutality where they'll kill your family and your dog and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like Trump is 100% due to a combination of ignorance and aggression, and just probably what he thinks is entertaining, has pushed those boundaries to a level that has damaged the discourse. And he's definitely, in that way, I do believe he is part of the cause as well, right? Like you say, symptom versus cause. He's an amplifying effect, and his disregard for some of those boundaries or those etiquettes, and I think mainly due to ignorance, he has caused that. And so I do agree with that.
All right, so next one. And this kind of relates to one of the earlier points, but I'll get to it more explicitly here, which is that I don't give enough credit to the upsides of Trump, particularly his policy achievements, and maybe more specifically, I look at him asymmetrically. So I'm kind of biased to focus at his failures and don't really pay much attention to his successes.
Ooh, that was a telling point in our previous conversation where I was just you were going apeshit on Trump. And I was like, okay, can you just give him one thing? Just tell me one thing that he did that you thought was good in his administration. And you couldn't really even bring yourself to do that. And so I think it's those kind of things that what I meant. And I do agree that, but again, it's in the heat of the conversation, right? To the point where I think, I'm not sure if that part made the cut, but it was, you could kind of say, okay, well, look, if he had a good outcome, such as reducing tax on business, then I support that. But that was kind of nothing to do with him thinking that was a good idea. He was just trying to play some kind of political leverage or whatever. So yeah, I tend to agree, but I will give you the acknowledgement that you don't believe that there's nothing good there. You just don't see it in that angle because, like you said, it's tainted by his intention, which is probably something that I could give a little bit more weighting to, right? I'm by looking at this, I wouldn't say academically, but trying to follow his policies rather than looking at the man and the intent, it kind of is a bit backwards. And I do agree with that. A really good example of this is, of all podcasts, Trump was on Theo Von's podcast in the last, and he went directly, I think, after Bernie Sanders, and they were talking about healthcare. And Theo Von, the comedian, was kind of saying, healthcare is, the number one cause of bankruptcy in America, personal bankruptcy, and it's just you don't know how much you get in charge and all this kind of stuff. And Trump said that we actually came out with this policy when I was in office that was going to force the hospitals and the medical industry to disclose exactly how much their things cost. So you could say if you want to get an MRI in this hospital versus that, you can actually choose. He's like, but Biden and Theo was like, oh, that's incredible. That's what we want, right? But Biden didn't, and Harris didn't see it through, so they fucked it. And I was like, okay, this is like going to be a really interesting case study in exactly what we've been talking about, right? Because if you have half a brain, you know that Trump did more damage to the healthcare in that liberal sense of free healthcare. And by throwing a little nugget out there, it's kind of a very real distraction of something that, yes, he put out there, but it was never implemented. And to my surprise, the comments did reflect a little bit of that. It was kind of like some people like, Trump 2024 and the eagle and the flag. But for every one of those, there was someone saying, hey, but this was also the guy that denied, 45 million people of healthcare caps. And actually, he's anti-free healthcare and all this kind of other stuff, right? So I think that there's a bit of space in there. That made me a bit more hopeful. But going back to your point, so why would Trump have put that kind of price disclosure in? Like, why would he have done that? Like, what's the intent? And I don't believe he kind of thinks about it on the same policy or party lines that we're used to of someone like a Bernie Sanders, who is a free healthcare for all, right? And that's the real travesty, that a country like America, the richest country in the world, has shit healthcare compared to Canada, Australia, even the UK. I don't think Trump thinks like that. I don't think he's like, I'm on a spectrum of public versus private healthcare. Like that kind of causing them to, that policy around cost disclosure probably came from like a totally left field where he's like, like this makes no sense from my business. And so I'm going to put this in. So I think that's why he's very confusing and is very like the intent is very hard to kind of narrow down on. And to your point, I don't think he has any values in that sense. Like I don't think
maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, I think it is. I think he has business sense, a very crude kind of business sense where he's like an Asian uncle. He's like he sees every interaction in life as a negotiating deal. Where at the end of that deal, I've either bargained the price down, or I've got more, or I've made a relationship that I can leverage later. And I think he goes through life like aggregating his interactions like that. And at the end of the day, he's either made more or made less, right? And I don't think he thinks in these kind of more political terms that we're used to.
I think so if he's driven by like a commercial acumen or whatever, but a lot of the time, these things, like you've got to deal with a lot of like really complex feedback loops. So I'm not commenting about the health price one that you talked about, but like another one being the weather service. So this notion that why did we need like a government run weather service? Like we have weather.com without realizing that weather.com gets its data from the publicly funded weather service. So, but whenever you kind of unpick it, like the layers and the consequences of things, like there's all these really complicated feedback loops that don't apply in kind of more just simple commercial settings. Like I'm just going to negotiate in a zero-sum sense and I either pay this much or that much. Whereas in government, you got to think about, well, if I do that, I might at this superficial first round level pay this much. But like I've also got to think about all the second round, third round impacts of what I'm doing. But the next thing I want to talk about is intent. I don't know there's a lot of intent when it comes to Trump. Like I think he might sort of be briefed on a policy that his team's cooked up and then sort of be like, okay, well, my intent is to do this thing. But I don't think there's much original intent from Trump. But back to like the notion of him having like policy like successes, like I don't know that there are that many. Like if you take a broad view, so if you genuinely look at the Trump administration and you think, okay, so the things that he did or that were achieved by the Trump administration that would not have been achieved by just about any other administration that could possibly be in its place, what were the things that they did better than any other any other alternative administration would have done? And in fact, I don't think there are. If you take a broad view, so even tax cuts, they were very controversial. So you could certainly say, well, I'm a beneficiary of the tax cuts, so they would be good. I'd support them or whatever. But then equally, if you look at them against another suite of like maybe more objective metrics, you could equally come to a conclusion that they weren't a policy success. But like, let's just say they were. I don't think they were a policy success because of Trump. I think they were a success despite of Trump. So to be more specific on what I mean by that, Mnuchin, as Treasury Secretary at the time, he was the brains behind the tax cut package, right? He was the one who developed it, who got it through, and all that sort of stuff, right? I don't think his job was made easier by having Donald Trump around, kind of guiding him in the development of that package. I think his life was made exponentially harder as a result of Trump. And you could say that about, I think, just about any policy area that Trump decided he wanted to get his hands involved in. And maybe I'll make a stronger point about that, is that I think the Trump administration, that is all of the people he appointed to cabinet and all of his appointees that like to run government, I think they would have been better off without Trump. So I think if you took the Trump administration minus Trump, you might even have a good government. But I think the risk and some of the setbacks were because of Trump and his self-belief and his meddling and his whatever.
Yeah. Look, I tend to agree with your characterization, right? And I'm basing that on some of the elements that you spoke about, where people that you listen to long enough, if you listen to long enough, you start to really find credible, and people that used to work for him, like Anthony Scaramucci and people like this, right, who they all have their own issues, but you can tell, like you said, you've triangulated enough points of reference for how Trump operates. So I kind of tend to agree. Now, my issue with you thinking this is that on other topics, you wouldn't be so sure. You'd be like how. So take something like the Abraham Accords, which absolutely the administration pushed through. You're kind of saying, well, Trump is so dysfunctional that he would have hampered that process rather than helped it. And on any other topic, you wouldn't so confidently say that, because how can you know, right? And it takes you back to this idea that what you've heard about the man is kind of like discounting everything, even the good things. It's like, okay, well, he did some good things, but he either hampered it and they would have been better without him, or perhaps did it by accident, whatever it is, right? Like, I think that's the problem sometimes. Like, you can't really know these things to be saying.
Well, let me just touch on that. I mean, I don't know enough about the Accords I don't even know enough about the policy themselves, let alone how they developed within the closed doors of the Trump administration. But let's just say they are a very nuanced piece of policy that finely and delicately balanced multiple competing interests. Does that sound like something Donald Trump would come up with and help with and assist with? And just as I said, I'm happy to kind of plead a bit of ignorance in this space, but this is the guy who was basically saying, the solution to Syria is we've got to get some SWAT teams in and assassinate Assad, right? And then his advisors saying basically, we won't be doing that. We'll this is not a guy whose instincts are delicate and careful compromise and balance.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've purposely picked one which is essentially a negotiation. It's is a negotiation style activity rather than a policy, so to speak, at least like a domestic policy. And I do think, not that I'm far from an expert on the area, but when you think about the things around the way the US bloc kind of put incentives and things and had to make deals, especially with Morocco and recognizing sovereignty and all this kind of stuff, I do think it's...
Hey, Trump wouldn't even know where Morocco is. Can we just say that? He didn't know what NATO was, right? This is classic work of people working in the foreign policy community. This is not the work of Trump.
Hey, I thought your whole basis was that he doesn't take direction.
If he gets something on a platter and he can't be bothered to do anything with it, you might be lucky enough that he won't take any interest with it and get it by successfully. But the moment he takes interest in and I guess there's a difference as well between defense and offense, and I think it's the offense part where he doesn't take advice. It's this is the thing I want to do, as opposed to this is the BAU stuff, right? And it's the stuff he actually wants to do where he doesn't take advice.
Fair enough. All right. Let's move on.
All right, so next one is Trump appears much worse than he really is because he tends to be vilified by the media and elites generally can't stand him. He might talk trash, but talk and actions aren't necessarily the same thing, and his actions are far less bad than how he is framed.
Ooh, I like this one. Look, I think we had an exchange about this, and I think I used I don't know whether, again, this made the cut, but I used the analogy of like the drunk Irish uncle at the bar who, whenever you sit down and have a beer with him, he tells these ridiculous stories that are exaggerated, and like you can tell he's lying, even though he's trying to act like he's not lying. It's just part of his mode of operation. And I do think Trump is like that. Like he constantly exaggerates and uses hyperbole and all these kind of things because at his heart he is an entertainer, right? And I think that he's learnt that over long, being involved in TV and The Apprentice and all these kind of things, right? And really, if you look at the case study of Trump, he lost all his money doing his original work in construction stuff, and he really had his second chance of his wealth and his career by betting on himself. His brand, the Trump brand, was essentially what allowed him to get back into the green. So I think that for someone like him, he does play off that. He exaggerates and he says things for entertainment value, number one, and number two, for as again, which I believe is one of his core beliefs, the fact that he still thinks The Art of the Deal is the most important book that exists in the world. It's his negotiation tactics. He will throw outrageous statements out there because he either thinks that it will have cut through from a negotiation point of view, a power dynamic perspective, or it'll throw his opponent off balance. And I think that is part of the dirty art of being a corporate bully. I think that he does these things quite consciously, or he's been doing them so long now. The man's in his 70s, where it's now just become a part of his, unconscious competency. But going back to it, yes, I believe that is a style thing. I don't think that everything that comes out of his mouth he actually wants to do or he will do, which is really tricky. And again, not a great fit for office. But yeah, I do think in this case, the bark is worse than the bite.
So there was a time, particularly when the Rocket Man stuff was, North Korea and Trump, and they were tweeting each other and all this stuff, where there was a time, and I don't know what year, whether it was 2017 or 2018 or something, but there was a moment, I think it was before they had their meeting in Singapore, where I was thinking, is Trump like this genius? Strategic ambiguity is like a thing, right? It's like the whole US policy on Taiwan, will it defend Taiwan or not defend Taiwan, is strategic. It's designed that way for very important reasons. And I was thinking, is Trump like being like this crazy man? Like, is that part of the strategy? Like, be the crazy man that you don't know what he's going to do, so you don't want to push him.
Yeah, the mad dog.
But I thought that. I thought, could this be like this genius of the man? And then the next thing is he's like fucking meeting Kim Jong-un in Singapore, and they're like trading hats, and like fucking Dennis Rodman comes out. That's not what's going on.
And I said to Putin, don't you do it.
So my response to this point is that it might be true among some segments of the media and some opinion leaders and the like, but when you sort of say like the notion that like the mainstream media is like this has this unfair no, I think the mainstream media that's against Trump is like that is the right place to be, and in some ways he's actually worse than how he's framed like in the media, because they tend to attack his like or showcase his brutishness and like when he lies or something like that. But for me, his real flaws are actually like around governance and policy psychology. And they're not interesting to the media. So they don't tend to kind of play up to that side of him. Like his lack of ability to make decisions, or maybe like the way he makes decisions. Like they don't tend to be the things that the media focus on. Like they focus on he was filmed in a trailer saying that he grabbed women by the pussy. Like let's make that into the big news story, as opposed to the fact that like he almost made some really bad like decisions, but his staff saved him from himself, right?
Yeah, look, and I think it's that whole thing of the problem with Trump is that when he makes a bad decision, he doesn't think it's a bad decision. He thinks it's the best decision because he made it. And I think that's the thing that really rubs you the wrong way. That like, there's just no way for him to learn and grow and to kind of, look. I never wanted to get into a situation where I'm defending Trump, because I already started that chat by saying I think that he's not the right decision, and he's unfit for a role as important as that. And the more and more I was thinking about it, I guess it's also the stakes as well, right? Like, we think we're protected here in Australia, but we're not. Like, I mean, it does really matter in the next kind of 100 years what America does for the rest of the world, right? And I did reflect on that a little bit in the last week. That there's always something greater at risk, right? If you think to the future. And I can see how people get caught up in that, and they're willing to kind of be very, very careful with how they're portraying things. Like, is it worth having a conversation about the border? Or is it more important the greater goal of making sure Trump doesn't get elected because he'll fuck something else up? And I think that's where, like, the high-minded people like Sam Harris and stuff get to. That actually, like, there's an existential nature to this threat. There's something bigger at stake, and that people are being, again, like, fooled by looking at little policy things, like you mentioned, rather than recognizing the threat of the man. And I also think that the main thing for me, and I know that you didn't feel exactly the same, but not wanting to transition properly or encourage, even just fanning any little kind of cinder of that is probably enough to destabilize the democratic process that should probably kind of void your return to politics.
Okay. Final 2 points. 2 quick ones, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, number 8. It's not clear that Kamala Harris is better than Trump, and at the margin, Trump may be even preferable, even if he is substantially unfit for office. That's number 8. Number 9 is people like me shouldn't moralize, and it should be fine to support Trump without being subjected to vitriol.
Okay, let me start with the last one. So the first point of disagreement is that by having any kind of positive view of a part, a segment, a fraction of Trump or his record in administration makes you a Trump supporter, or that somehow you hold a candle for Trump or would want him to win the election. I think that's the first part that I think is tough. And I go back to earlier conversations where everyone's so desperate for a signal out of people that kind of makes it easy to understand who you are and what you support, because they have the rest of the narrative written after that. It's like, oh, you're a masked squarer, you must be some liberal fruitcake or whatever, right? Or you got a MAGA hat on, although that probably is a bit more conclusive. But you know what I mean? So I take it.
It could be a make the middle great again hat.
Yeah, and no one reads it, so yes, I take offense with that, and I feel a false sense of entitlement that I should be deserved that leeway. That actually, if you only listen to me, you realize that I'm neither left or right or whatever, right? And I think that maybe that's a bit naive for me, but I do feel resentful at that. Number one. Number two, this idea, and it goes back to this idea that people are fundamentally misguided or fooled or whatever. I do think that going back to it, if I want to try to have a discussion about one of the issues, just because Trump said it doesn't mean it's invalid, or just because someone is coming from a mouthpiece we don't want, it's invalid. And I feel, I don't want to be branded as a Trump person, because I'm not. But also equally, I think that you need to be able to have a conversation with someone who is on the opposite side of the bench, right? And just have like a blank slate, talk about things, right? I think that's really, really important.
Can I touch on that? So I think this comes back to like the rules of the game, right? Because there is quite a difference in that situation where you have a genuine Trump supporter who wants to talk about the border issues and someone who isn't a Trump supporter that wants to talk about the border issues. So and they are actually going to be quite different conversations, and so they should. So if, for example, you want to have a genuine good faith conversation about the border, but you can rule out any notion of support from Trump, you can say, okay, well, let's put Trump to one side. Like, why are we even... The border is a completely different issue to Trump. Like, why are we even mentioning Trump? It's got nothing to do with Trump. It's a policy issue for the current Biden administration. So it's nothing to do with Trump. Or it's an issue that you might benchmark the Kamala Harris campaign against, right? And you can talk about it. But I think people can like have this effect of, well, actually, I'm quite sympathetic to Trump, so I'm talking to you about the border, but really this is like, I'm really actually motivated by my support for Trump. So that's why this kind of thing happens, right? And I don't think you're a supporter of Trump, and I've never thought that, but I have thought and I have sensed some of the things that I am so like offended by when it comes to Trump that you're not offended by. So even though I'm not for a second thinking that you're going to like, well, not that we can even vote in the election, but it's not like I'm concerned
if you believe Trump, maybe we can multiple times.
Multiple times, yeah. But I'm not genuinely thinking that you're an evangelical for Trump. But I do get a sense that there's some of the things, and it's particularly around the competence of Trump, maybe, for example, that where I have a very clear worldview of Trump that and my sense is, and I don't, and maybe it's just like we haven't talked about it to like close that gap, but I haven't been confident enough to feel that we're on the same page regarding his competence, such that like we can move past that and have that conversation about like then another topic, because yeah, I mean, like we've had lots of conversations about lots of topics on this podcast that Trump would probably have a position on. Yeah. But we haven't talked about it in the context of Trump. But if you're talking about those issues and it hasn't come up, right? Why would it? Why should it? But if it comes up in the context of Trump, then you have to address, like if Trump's the connecting factor, then that has to sort of be part of the conversation. So anyway.
All right, let's go to the other point with Kamala. There's a whole separate conversation on Kamala that's very hard to kind of say, because what's loaded in that question is, like, would you vote Kamala or Trump, right? And I'm going to start off by saying that for all the reasons that we spoke about, of course, I believe Kamala versus Trump. So, okay, let me rephrase it into a bit more of a solid kind of apples and apples. If you cloned Kamala 4,000 times and that was her government, and you clone Trump 4,000 times and that was his government, 100%. Okay? Horrific thought experiment. But, of course, Kamala is going to be...
I'm just waiting to see the experiment where they have babies.
There was an AI thing that actually Russell Brand released where it was Trump and Kamala, like, pashing, and then there was a baby and a little Donald Trump baby came out. It was so violating. And he was like rubbing the pregnant belly, like Kamala's pregnant belly. Oh, it's awful. Anyway, of course, Kamala is going to be a more competent and more kind of positive influence in that respect. So I think that probably answers it in a more holistic sense. Do I think, going back to the competency, that there are some areas that Trump would have an advantage over Kamala? Yes, I do think so. And again, this is a point of contention between us. It goes down to the whole business thug negotiating thing. I think that there is a world where having a strongman image and being one of the bros, getting shit done on a golf course, like I do think that as liberal and as progressive as we've become, I'm not naive enough to think that still doesn't have a place in the way things get decided and agreed upon in certain stages.
Can I just ask you a question, though, with that? So let's just say there's an English test, right? And in the English test, you get points for grammar, spelling, creative writing, or, different aspects, right? Yeah. Is it like, okay, so Trump might do better at spelling than Kamala, right? Let's say. But, like, how does the overall score stack up? Who gets the highest overall score? Dude,
it's like what I'm saying, like for you to just kind of conceptualize the ratios here. It's like, that scene on Game of Thrones where they bring out Khaleesi, the mother of dragons, and to be accepted in the Dothraki, she has to eat like the horse heart. All I'm saying is Kamala's not eating the horse heart. Donald Trump is. In that's the one factor that I'm giving him weight. All the rest goes to Kamala.
So I guess just to be clear, in no world are you sort of thinking that Trump is better than Kamala Harris? And in fact, you put the finger on the scale to Kamala Harris, say, no, she's a lot better It's just that I'm not going to say that Trump has zero areas of strengths. It's just that I'm going to acknowledge those, and then even though I can accept that Kamala Harris is more suited, then
yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's my position. It's eating the horse heart, right? Like it's pumping your fists after you've been shot in the ear. It's like all these little things, right? Like that are obscure but meaningful in their own way. But absolutely, it's a drop in the ocean.
All right. Maybe one question before we wrap it up. Given this conversation, I think you probably felt I was a bit, maybe, I don't know if extreme's the right word, but like a little bit kind of...
Off the middle.
Off the middle, yeah. That's actually a good way to put it. Putting the actual, like, the rhetoric of, like, the conversation aside, because I don't think my position now is any different to what it was a week ago, only that it might be more communicated in a more nuanced way. Would you still think that? Do you still think I'm off the middle, or do you think? Because I think I am in the middle. Like I think I've got the grasp of the middle. So I'm keen to understand if now that maybe we've nailed our respective positions a little bit better, whether you would think that.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to reflect on how your perception of the middle is coloured and influenced by what kind of language you use, right, and how extreme the delivery of it is, right? So now a really good kind of case for that is that in our previous conversation, you called Trump like stupid and a buffoon, right? Like you haven't done that this time, but you still believe that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So like I think there's, and I was actually reflecting on this, right? Like you kind of, the fact that you have to fight what you really want to say or your instincts, like to have a certain type of conversation, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It does have its place.
I don't think using like language of that nature is good for discourse, right? Because it's not helpful language, right? So, of course, but like in terms of like an actual substantive position on this topic, on Trump, surely the middle can't be one where, like, I guess maybe like, let's say roughly half of America who are going to vote in this election are going to vote for Trump, and half of America, roughly, are going to vote for Kamala Harris. Like, that can't be the true middle. Like, that 50-50 isn't actually the middle. Like, the middle has to be one which puts Trump... Like, the middle surely isn't that 50-50. The middle is more like 90-10, you know what I mean? Like...
Well, to answer your question directly, I do think you're in the middle now, because my middle is the ability to have the conversation, right? And so
such a cheesy end.
No, it's true though, because you've put it aside, and I know it's when you feel like that with Trump, it's not easy to kind of force yourself to take the Michelle Obama kind of, when they go low, you go high. And in this conversation, you've gone high, right? But does it feel good or not? I don't know. And I'm not saying that like from a high and mighty point of view, but I'm just saying that to me, that's the pit that I was reacting to, right? And of course, like, we've all got our role to play in a conversation. If you're pushing hard in one area, then I'm going to push on the other side. So I think that you have reached the middle. And look, not 90-10, but I do believe that Trump has never won the popular vote, and he's not a very liked candidate in terms of like household likability. And yeah, like it's definitely not 50-50 even when you correct for some of all that stuff that I was mentioning around a Republican always votes red, so to speak.
All right. Well, I think we can take that as a successful
I still want to go to a Trump rally though.
All right. Over and out.